Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I've got a huge video that's going to be talking about all sorts of things from the past weekend's tournaments to the new hot decks that you may see to an update on my power rankings and something brand new that I hope is live and ready to go by the time you've watched this video, my new card of the day reviews. So let's get to it. Alright, so quickly I'm going to get into the tournament recap, and I'm not going to keep you here too long. I'm going to highlight some things, and then I've got a chart that will go over a lot of the details. But this is the Pocket Legends League tournament, and all of these tournaments that I will be covering were several hundreds of people. You know, some as high as over 1,000. Some of these tournaments had $1,000 in prize pool money, and there's a lot to take away here. But basically, this is a specific kind of cut, so this is only a top 26. Whereas some of the other tournaments are top 32, top 16, and top 8. So I've got a chart for all that, but basically the first thing that I'll kind of want to point out here is the really interesting winner here was just a base Charizard deck. Now the other top 4 decks, Mewtwo and Gardevoir, Pikachu and Electrode, and a Greninja and Articuno deck. So I've got some data on that, but again, if you wanted to look at the metagame for the Pocket Legends tournament, you can see that there is a large majority of Mewtwo and Gardevoir decks. There was also a large majority when you take a look at the Charizard decks too. I mean, we're talking about almost 20% of the metagame were Charizard decks, okay? Whether it was Charizard Arcanine or Charizard Moltres. And then you've got the usual suspects up there with the Pikachu decks also approaching, 25% when you add all the variants up together. So that is one tournament. Now let's head to another tournament, the Pikaverse Pocket League Season number 1. Now this is the one with the $1,000 prize pool. It only had a top 8 cut, but you can kind of take a look at the top 4 here. It came down to a Arcazard deck, a Mewtwo deck, and then 2 Pikachu decks, which ended up meeting in the finals. And the winner was a Pikachu and Electrode variant, which went unbeaten, which was, that's crazy to say. But again, this kind of drives home the fact that in one of my power ranking videos, I said currently, in the beginning, I was with the Raichu variant. And then as Arcazard kind of became more popular, I kind of switched sides and kind of went more towards that Electrode variant. And so it's really interesting to see that, this is the second weekend in a row where we've seen a large tournament that was taken down by a Pikachu and Electrode variant. And although a lot of people are playing the Zebstrika variant. So that's also interesting. And then obviously the other Pikachu variant with Raichu still continues to be very strong and performs very well statistically. When you take a look at this metagame, again, it's going to be very similar. Like all of these tournaments, the metagame is looking roughly the same. I mean, again, you take a look at here, Charizard is almost 20% of the metagame right there as well. You take a look at Mewtwo, it's about 25%. And then when you take a look at adding up all the Pikachu variants, again, you're probably getting closer to that 22 to 25% range, right? I guess it's around 25% technically. So again, I mean, you're seeing similar metagames in terms of the decks that are being brought, and then slightly, maybe some slightly different variations of how they're performing, but for the most part, it's pretty similar across the board. Now, this is the AdvancedGG Tournament. Again, this is $500 prize pool. Had, I think, like 600 people or something like that. I mean, this is a big tournament. And this cut was actually to a top 16. When you take a look at the top 4, it's got 2 Mewtwo and Gardevoir decks. It's got a Arcazard deck and then a Pikachu with a Raichu variant. So, again, I've got a chart for all of the top cut, but there is a spicy deck in here that I will talk about in this video. And honestly, it was a video it's a deck that I was going to make a video about this past weekend, but I decided to release my No EX guide. So if you're interested in playing the No EX format or seeing what's good, maybe you want to play in a tournament that's No EXs, definitely check out that video. All right. So again, just kind of showing you the top cut there. But let's move to the metagame. And when you take a look at the metagame, again, you can go ahead and see that 25% Mewtwo. So this is, you're roughly seeing a quarter of the meta, maybe 30% of the meta being Mewtwo Gardevoir decks. And then when you take a look at the Pikachu variants, again, you're getting close to that, this is going to be 17. Yeah, this is going to be close to about 22% to 25% if you add up all the Pikachu variants. And then you take a look at the Arcazard and the Moltres Charizard deck, you combine that, that's roughly 19%, 20% of the meta there. So again, you're seeing very similar numbers across all of these tournaments for the most part. And then the last tournament we'll talk about is the Ursi tournament. And again, the winner of this was another Pikachu variant, but this time it was the Raichu variant. And then when you take a look at the top 4, you notice a new interesting deck that's starting to hit the scene. And again, I've got this in my power rankings that you're going to see this video and you're going to get to see some test hands. So stay tuned to that. But the Pikachu variant with Raichu comes out on top. A Mewtwo Gardevoir deck gets second. Pikachu Zebstrika gets third. And then the spicy deck, the Wigglytuff and Arbok deck, gets top 4. So again, you can take a look at all of these decks here. Again, this was a top 32 cut. Ursi's done a great job, helping. I would say that she's arguably the reason why we're seeing these $500 prize pool, these $1,000 prize pool tournaments start to pop up now, and this is a good thing for the game. So really cool to see. But if you take a look at the metagame, again, about 23% of the meta was Mewtwo, and then when you add up the Charizard variants, you're getting to about that 17%, and then the Pikachu variants, again, you combine them all, you're getting close to 21, 22%, maybe even as high as 23% if you add up all the variants. But again, really cool to see. Again, a lot of the metagame is going to be roughly the same across most of these tournaments. So let me get to you the charts that I want to show you. So there were 82 decks total that made top cuts this weekend, and this chart kind of goes over each of how many there were. Now, starting with the largest numbers and then working our way down, there were 34 different Pikachu decks. In terms of qualifiers, obviously there's like roughly three main versions and variants. There were 19 Mewtwo Gardevoir decks. There were 10 Arcazard decks. There were 5 Arbok and Wigglytuff decks. And then there were 4 Articuno Greninja decks. There were 4 Charizard decks, so that's just Charizard and Moltres. And then when you get down to the lower numbers, there were 2 Starmie Greninja decks. There were 2 Starmie Articuno decks. There was 1 18 Trainer Articuno deck, and then there was 1 Wigglytuff and Exeggutor deck. So this is a breakdown of like how the meta is kind of shaping up. And so one of the things that I want to point out here is, most of these tournaments have the largest number of participants for one deck is usually Mewtwo. But what you're seeing right here is, even though there's way more people playing Mewtwo, Pikachu is actually performing better when you talk about converting entries into the top cuts. So you have a better chance of playing Pikachu and qualifying for top cut than you do playing Mewtwo and qualifying for top cut. Now that could be for a variety of reasons. But again, you kind of start going down the path of the other numbers. You start to see, think about Charizard variants, whether it's Arcazard or, base Charizard. You can kind of do the math there. I guess it's like it's definitely worse when you compare it to, it's got a lot of similar numbers, maybe slightly lower than the Pikachu contestants that are entering. But again, if you're taking a look just from the numbers point of view, it seems very, straightforward that, hey, if you want the best chance to qualify, you either play a extremely off meta deck that nobody really sees coming, that has really good matchups into, Pikachu and Mewtwo specifically, or, you just play Pikachu. If you play Pikachu, you probably have a good chance, to, perform well because it does so well against the field. So this next part of the video, I actually want to transition to talking about 2 of the decks in particular that are sort of off meta picks, one being Arbok and Wigglytuff, and then the other being Wigglytuff and Exeggutor. So let's talk about that. So about 2 weeks ago, we saw a deck pop up on PokemonMeta.com, which, by the way, I highly recommend as a resource for just finding decks and finding out what's kind of working at the moment. But about, 2 weeks ago, we saw a new deck pop up with Wigglytuff and with Exeggutor. Now, it's worth noting that I think at this time, the promo Jigglypuff wasn't even out. And obviously, the promo Jigglypuff does add something to this deck. But just taking a look at this deck, I was a fan of it just because I played Exeggutor. However, I think that there are some big upgrades that you can make to this deck now. And so basically, the upgrades that I would make would be these. So this is what I would personally play right now, playing Exeggutor as well as Wigglytuff. And again, I just want to like drive home the fact that, dude, I really wanted to make this before the weekend because I thought that this was a really solid, cool deck. I didn't know that it would be able to, take down any of these events just because, that grass typing is very rough right now. But there's some really interesting factors about this deck. Now, let me point out a couple factors. Well, first, you're playing that 2-3 lineup, which I definitely love of both of your stage 1s, which gives you the ability to pivot into large HP or quick damage, or both in some cases, right? Now, the HP thresholds of this deck are really unique because outside of Raichu, you're going to survive a lot of attacks from every Pokemon in the metagame, right? One of the big issues that you'll run into is Arcanine just destroys Exeggutor. There's not much you can do about that. However, when you take a look at Starmie, when you take a look at Articuno, when you take a look at Pikachu, like you can win some of those races with Exeggutor. And that's the early game part of the deck, right? The early game part of the deck is you're using Exeggutors, hopefully evolving them on your second turn of the game, or you're potentially hitting things with Farfetch'd earlier and then retreating out of it into your Exeggutor. So that's kind of how that works. And you do want to save that Farfetch'd because it's able to finish things off in the mid to late game. So that's something to pay attention to. But you've got that early game aggression, and then you combo it with some potential mid to late game pressure, which could be Wigglytuff EX, or let's just say that you see the opportunity to get a big knockout maybe on an opponent's Ralts early in the game. You could potentially knock out their Ralts with just the base Wigglytuff. The closer of this deck can be Wigglytuff EX, and again, the bulk factor of having 140 HP is massive because 140 HP is going to survive a lot of things in the meta, but again, you're going to fall victim to those Raichus. So if you're playing against a Pikachu Raichu deck, you definitely want to be aware of that threshold. You definitely want to always be aware of the times where your opponent can slap down that third energy, or they already have 3 energy and they have a Pikachu on their bench. You always want to be aware of that and try to play around it if possible and not give them easy one-shots on your Wigglytuff, especially because, hey, they're losing 3 energy, but you're potentially losing 3 energy as well, or you're losing 2 energy and you're giving up 2 points, which now makes, the game a lot more difficult to win if you didn't lose on the spot. So again, the sleep from Wigglytuff can basically put it into contention to knock out things like Charizard potentially. It can knock out things like Mewtwo depending on potion math. But again, like you can get potentially 2 hits, maybe even 3 hits with your Wigglytuff EX in the mid to late game, which can win you the game. But the early pressure is going to come from those Exeggutors. And again, this is kind of going back to my Venusaur and Exeggutor list that I was able to win a tournament with at that time, before 17 fire decks existed. But basically, this can make you play, your opponent play a long game where they have to knock out one base Exeggutor, another base Exeggutor, and then they've got to figure out a way to knock out either Exeggutor EX or Wigglytuff EX, which that can be very difficult for a lot of decks to one-shot them. But again, looking at the trainers, you'll notice there's no Erica. I don't believe in playing Potion either. I would rather play Red Card and just learn how to pilot the Red Card, especially in a tournament setting. And then in ladder, I do enjoy punishing people that just Professor's Research turn 1 and end with 5 cards and, 1 basic. I enjoy doing that. That's just me. This isn't a red card video. In fact, you should go watch my red card video if you haven't already. It will most likely teach you something about red card, whether it's the ladder red card or whether it's open deck list tournament red card. Definitely check that video out. But again, I do think that this deck is a solid contender. I do think that it's a very solid deck. And if you're trying to grind for this current event, hey, it could be a deck that catches some people off guard. And if you get some lucky coin flips, you can go ahead and potentially get your 5 wins. As we draw some hands with this deck, just to kind of get a feel for it and, show you how the openers look. One thing I want to point out about the event right now is some people may feel stressed and, like they gotta play Mewtwo, they gotta play Pikachu. And what I would tell you is, hey, play a deck that you're comfortable with, and hey, don't be afraid to play a deck that you have fun with, because if you're having fun with the deck, and then, you end up getting the win streak, that's great. But again, I do think that, hey, don't feel like you have to try hard. There's still multiple days left of the event, depending on when you're watching this video, or maybe the event's over, but you do have time. So don't feel like you have to rush it. And again, like it's a cool little event. I've already got some wins with like my Beedrill Exeggutor deck. So there's definitely potential for you to have some fun there. But again, as you can see, these test hands, very solid deck, definitely capable of winning some games. Now, another deck that popped up in the top 4 of some tournaments and has been performing pretty well in some other different tournaments is going to be Wigglytuff and Arbok, along with Weezing. Now, this is the deck list that I would actually lean towards playing if I was playing this deck. And basically, it's going to rely on Wigglytuff kind of in the mid to late game to come in and potentially, finish things off. Or, it's going to go ahead and basically trap things with Arbok like you typically would in a Weezing Arbok deck. The ability to soak damage and then Koga your Weezing up is also pretty huge. But again, the Arbok is slightly glassy, being able to get one-shot by Pikachu and Giovanni, and then obviously everything in the entire deck just loses to Raichu if Raichu is able to surge, right? But again, I think that this is a very solid deck, and I think that if you're wanting to play something that's not necessarily like, hey, this is not the same old deck that everybody's playing, or you really enjoy dark decks, this could be a really fun deck for you. But again, like, when you play decks with Weezing and Arbok, you are a little glassy, so you definitely don't want to miss your evolutions. You definitely want to see your Kogas, and then Wigglytuff EX adds another factor where, hey, maybe, in the middle of the game, you're kind of pivoting into that Wiggly EX, you're able to stall out a little bit, or hey, maybe your Jigglypuff came in and did some work, and your opponent kept flipping tails. So again, pretty cool deck. Personally, I don't think you can go wrong with either of these decks if you're wanting to play something new. And again, in the event, both of these decks can work. And one thing I would also tell you about like a deck like this is if you're going into an event where you're going to see a lot of Pikachu and Mewtwo, this deck might be really good. So keep that in mind, right? Now, one more variant that I'll show you. Again, this is probably the deck that I'm the lowest on out of these decks. But this is going to be a Greninja deck with Wigglytuff, Bruxish, and Mewtwo EX. Now, this is going to play Psychic Energy, so that way you can go ahead and have those big, giant attacks with Mewtwo potentially. But one of the cool combos is going to be Greninja hitting something for 20, and then Bruxish coming in, and then being able to deal, a pretty big chunk of damage to it, right? Because again, if it's already got damage on it, that attack, second strike, is going to do more damage. So you're potentially dealing, 70 damage with this for 2 energy, and then obviously if you count the Greninja, that's a total of 90 damage. So pretty big attacks. It does play the Misty for the chance to high roll, but again, like you're not really winning the game on the spot a lot of the times that you Misty, compared to a deck playing Articuno and using Misty. So could Articuno fit in better? I don't know. I mean, that's up to you. But again, Mewtwo EX does add a cool little factor, and there's some cool hands that you can draw with this. But again, like it's going to come down to, can you get that Greninja down? Again, you might just want to play one energy type, and you can just go ahead and take out the Mewtwo and play Articuno, so that way you still have those Misty high rolls. But again, out of all 3 of these decks, this is definitely the deck that I am the lowest on personally. But that's just me. I'm just one person. So as I get to the last part of the deck, I do want to point you to my Twitter page, which I will be posting during the week, my newest form of content, which will be card of the days. So that way you can, every day I'm going to try during the week to post a card of the day review. This could be really, really helpful for just getting quick content, just in case, you don't want to sit through a whole video for me to talk about a card. But I'm going to talk about probably 1 card per day during the week, give you a little bit of my thoughts on it, maybe some cool combos with it, and then give it a rating out of 5. Just a little fun. Like I remember back in the day, for years, I would literally go to pojo.com and I would go to the Pokemon section and I would read the card of the days. And like one of the biggest things that it did for me is it's just like, I didn't even play Pokemon at that time, or like maybe I would like play Pokemon for like the sneak previews, but I didn't play it like, going to regionals and stuff. But I would just go look at the art, and then I would go read the cards and how they were doing and like some people's thoughts on them. And man, I just really enjoyed it. It felt like, back in the day we used to have magazines with like small card reviews, samples of decks, and those magazines were so like cool back in the day. And so I want to bring a little of that to my Twitter, to my X. And so I hope that you jump in. I hope that you check it out. I hope that you hit that follow button over there on Twitter, and then just, kind of It's a cool little way to keep track of how we saw cards in one period of time, and then maybe over time the card turned out to be really, really good or really, really bad, and we look back and say, wow, we were really smart, or we were really dumb. I can't believe we thought that card was bad. So again, card of the day, definitely look for that on my Twitter, which, by the way, the name is on the video. But let's talk about this new update to my power rankings. And if you remember, I try to do these every week, but again, that just kind of depends on how I'm feeling. But for this particular deck, let's go ahead and get through these ratings, and then we'll wrap the video up. This is Wigglytuff and Exeggutor, and personally, for the early game, I thought that this deserved a 3.5 out of 5. I thought it was highly reliant on Exeggutor, or maybe even, coin flips with Jigglypuff, and then, every now and then Farfetch'd comes in and does some 40 damage that really matters. But just like, I couldn't necessarily give it a super high rating just because it depends so much on that Exeggutor and so many matchups, right? And then for the mid to late game, I thought that the stage ones were pretty bulky for the most part. But again, one of those retreat costs is going to be very high, and you may have a trouble pivoting out of that active spot, but it is going to soak a lot of damage. But again, you can answer threats with sleep, you can answer threats with coin flips. There's some good options here. When you talk about the power of the deck, the attacks can scale from 30 damage to 80 damage, and that's not very high. But when you're putting things to sleep for that 80 damage, it can be pretty good. And then again, with Giovanni, you could potentially push that damage cap up to 90, right? So again, not terrible, but not great, just kind of in the middle. In terms of health, I've already kind of alluded to that, but I do think that the health is pretty solid. Now, one of the big things that you're losing with this particular variant of Exeggutor is no Erica, and that's kind of huge, especially when you run into cards like Pikachu EX, which may be hitting you for 90 before you can even get, your second attack off. Whereas if you played cards like Erica, you could potentially get 3 coin flips on that Exeggutor or that Exeggutor EX to potentially knock out that Pikachu or that Zapdos. So that's kind of one drawback, but I don't think that there's room for Erica. I think that if you played Erica, you would have to cut consistency from your stage 1s, or maybe some utility with your trainers. In terms of consistency, although it does rely on stage 1s, I do think that it's slightly mitigated by the fact that you're running 3 of the stage 1s. And so I think that that does kind of answer that consistency issue, although you're definitely going to have games where you wish you drew Exeggutor just slightly earlier, or maybe games that, hey, Wigglytuff came towards the end of the game and you needed it slightly earlier. But again, overall, I thought that this is a deck that can answer top meta decks, but again, it's going to rely early on those Exeggutors just because that's the early tempo usually, right? Although Farfetch'd can definitely fill that role. So moving on to Arbok, Weezing, and Wigglytuff. You'll notice that I did rate these decks basically the same rating, right? Like, although there's different categories that they may excel in, I basically said that these decks are roughly the same in terms of power level. If you take a look at this deck, it does have 2 stage 1 Pokemon that can pressure for pretty cheap. However, it is, you're not always going to want to just send that Arbok in and just start attacking with it unless it's a Moltres EX that you're trying to trap, or an EX Pokemon that you're trying to trap. So it can be a little tricky, even though they are relatively cheap attacks in the beginning of the game. In terms of the mid to late game, I think that all of these Pokemon are pretty expensive to retreat and when you start to evolve them. So that's where a card like Koga is going to definitely play a big role, even though you do play double X speed to help mitigate those retreat costs, right? In terms of, being able to close games out with poison and sleep, that's pretty powerful in some cases, right? In terms of power, this is a pretty low damage cap deck, but it is slightly mitigated with that sleep and poison, right? That poison can rack up over a turn or two. That sleep can give you another turn to get that hit in that you need for the knockout. And then again, when you take a look at things like health, Arbok is slightly glassy, right? I mean, pretty low HP for a lot of things. However, Weezing does survive a lot of things. And then obviously with Koga, you're getting that extra health boost. And then all of these Pokemon, although Wigglytuff can be tough, Wigglytuff can't be tough, that's funny, to one-hit knockout, all of these Pokemon are just getting destroyed by Raichu, so that's kind of one big issue. In terms of consistency, you are playing a pseudo stage 2 when you talk about Weezing and Koga, right? You can still Koga the same turn that you evolve Weezing. However, you do have to remember that that is pretty much a 2-card combo that you're going to need to really get good value out of that Weezing. The other thing that I would point out too is that you are reliant on like, you know, stage ones, and you're not playing that 2-3 lineup, but it is somewhat, you know, it is definitely something that you can deal with. Overall, it's like your typical Arbok and Weezing deck that does have good matchups into some of the top decks that play EX Pokemon, where they're not really attacking, they're using them to ramp, and you can lock those Pokemon in, but I do think it has slightly more upside than those typical Weezing and Arbok decks. I think that it's better to play Wigglytuff than it is to play Muck or Nidoking or anything like that. So I would say right now, this is the best dark type deck that you can play. And I hope that that helps you in your, you know, your quest to get 5 wins in the event. But I look forward to seeing you for more content. I hope that you check me out on Twitter and on Twitch, whether you want to watch me stream games live or whether you want to check in on those card of the day reviews. I look forward to seeing you there. And until next time, peace.